Just as in panel number one, we had a presentation, PowerPoint presentation in the second phase. In this second panel, we also have a PowerPoint presentation that will be presented to us by Mr. Takashi Omori, who is the chair of the Economic Committee at Apec and policy advisor to the Japanese Cabinet Office. So at this time, Mr. Omori, if you would please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and my thanks to the four organizers for giving me the opportunity to discuss with distinguished guests. Let me talk about structural reform, which I think is another aspect of sizing the moment, although it is closely related to the aspect of regional economic integration. Well, up to this year, we have been working, Economic Committee has been working on what we call the laser mandate on these 5 areas, competition policy, regulatory reform, corporate governance, etc. But this year, this laser mandate is going to expire. So that is why we have started our discussion on 2 sets of issues. One is on possible new priority areas. Some economies have already suggested to set new priority areas that includes labor market, social safety net, education, financial market regulation, etc. So naturally, one of the issues is what can be the new priority areas. And related to that, how best can APEC promote structural reform in these new areas? And of course, internal structure of the APEC is also an agenda. In addition to that, Economic Committee has started to discuss about what we should do on current laser areas. And perhaps I don't need to explain much about the background factor for this discussion. Firstly, global financial crisis revealed structural weakness of APEC economies. And secondly, we cannot continue extraordinary fiscal deficit or fiscal stimulus to go on forever. So we have to depend on real source of sustainable growth, which should come from further international integration or structural reform. And APEC has a tradition of structural reform and bodies for implementation, as well as mechanism for follow-up. So the key issue is that, as it is symbolized by the fact that APEC has started to discuss APEC-wise growth strategy, there has been a slight shift in emphasis towards sustainable growth from liberalization in trade and investment. I'm not downplaying the importance of liberalization, but I'm emphasizing the importance of the integrated approach with integration between the behind-the-border issue as well as at-the-border issues. And this shift is a natural and perhaps a necessary one as our economies are becoming more and more interdependent. And to be more specific, I'd like to point out the 3 important factors. One is that from now on, the much of the growth of the APEC region, or to more broadly the world growth, should come from the growth in emerging economies in Asia. Secondly, despite that fact, if we look at the emerging economies, there are a lot of structural weakness. I wouldn't go into the detail, but a lot of structural weakness, which might turn out to be serious growth constraints sooner or later. Thirdly, therefore, we have to help them to remove those possible growth constraints. But at the same time, we have to respect their own decision-making process. So we have to provide a kind of assistance, menu of assistance of a very good quality. So key issue here is how to effectively involve line ministries in charge of new priority areas especially in emerging economies. And because we think that what they are doing are very relevant to our growth strategy from the viewpoints of balanced growth and inclusive growth, etc. And during the past several years, we have learned lessons under the current LASER mandate. One is for structural reform. It is important to have a clear focus and a high-level political commitment. Another lesson is that cross-cutting viewpoints are quite important even when addressing sector-specific issues, because that enable us to take account of indirect impacts on economy, including on consumers, and we can take account of interaction between structural reform in related areas, including the sequential issue. And we have learned some lessons on general principles, guidelines of structural reform. And another thing that we learned is that we have to think seriously about what can be the effective implementation mechanisms. And this is a set of tools that we have been using in the Economic Committee. Of course, the traditional tools are sharing experiences and capacity buildings, but we have tried some other new ones, such as checklist, guidelines, stocktake, and updating exercise. We have recently started to have some kind of voluntary review of institutional framework, ministerial meeting, which turned out to be a big success, and ease of doing business, which is a new approach, a new collective approach based on indicators. But perhaps as we embark upon further behind the border, we have to think of what can be some new sort of tools. And this is the list of a tentative list of for discussion. One is peer review, as in OECD, and the second one is peer review with economy-wise action plan. But we may take an approach which is quite sort of in line with Apec non-binding nature, which is number 10 and 11. 10 is issue-specific joint seminar, perhaps jointly with fora in charge of specific relevant areas. And number 11 is a tailor-made approach, something like to ask economists to come up with their own agenda, and Apec colleagues can provide the best solutions in a non-binding way. So although the list of possible new tools we have started to discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Omori. If I could now ask the panelists for panel number 2 to join Mr. Omori and myself up here, I'd appreciate it. Of making sure that I give the maximum opportunity to the very distinguished panelists who are now coming before you, and knowing that I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch. So at this time, let me call on let's see, I guess we'll go right down the line here and start with you, Peter. As all of you know, Peter is from Brandeis University. So, Peter, if I just go ahead and ask you to make your presentation.
Thank you. This is a very important year. Next year will be also a very important year. I am, in addition to being a professor at Brandeis University, a senior fellow at the East-West Center. So I very much look forward to all these events unfolding in our backyard in Honolulu. What I want to argue for in the next few minutes is the notion of a fruitful APEC. And by that I mean to see how we could make APEC really translate into a series of harvests and series of products that we across the region can take great pride in. It has done that, and I think as this year's evaluation of the Bogor goals hopefully will show, it has made enormous achievements over those 20 years. This will be, by the way, a very important story for us to tell in the United States, and I hope that the evaluation will make that clear. But nevertheless, as Vice President Mondale introduced the topics this morning, there is nevertheless a deficit in recognition in the sense that APEC is good at translating its important, wide-ranging visions into equally effective projects. And so that's the piece that I'd like to talk about. This is an unusual opportunity because of the 2 years, and also APEC has accumulated a series of mechanisms, and that's what I'd like to speak about more in more depth, that give it unusual assets in addressing the problems that the region and the global economy face these days. So it's a case for more harvests. I realize that this is a very difficult issue, that Wendy and Kurt are challenged by these issues, as are their Japanese counterparts every day. But I'd like to push at what might make that happen. What are APEC's assets, which it brings to the table in this effort? APEC, as we know today, is facing a much more complicated international competitive picture than it did when it was established. There are layers of institution above it and below it, which do in some ways similar work. The G20 being the most prominent and the most important among these in recent years. Nevertheless, APEC has some very unusual characteristics that make it appropriate for the challenges that the global economy now faces. It's trans-Pacific. It has a non-binding and consensual approach to solving problems. As we discussed in a symposium yesterday, it can make a series of agreements which have been described as middle agreements. They're not just seminars, they're not just conversations about topics, nor are they international treaties. It can make a series of agreements on very specific topics that can have an effect. And it has the ability, specifically through the Pathfinder framework, to include groups of economies that can collaborate on an issue without necessarily having to involve the whole 21 and the broad range of complexities that such a large group would bring with it. This means that APEC has a series of assets, a series of modalities with which it can solve problems, approach problems that have proved too difficult in many cases to solve at the international level, that have led to various initiatives running aground in trade, in finance, and in other areas in our global institutions. And indeed, it makes it appropriate for exactly that 21st century set of issues that Wendy spoke about: services, environment, transparency, governance, and so on. So let me focus for a minute on the Pathfinder model. It is a mechanism for having agreements among 21 minus X economies. It came out of the Shanghai Accord of 2001. The Shanghai Accord made it quite clear that it wanted the Pathfinder model to work on the basis of APEC principles: open, inclusive, consensual, and so on. And that the idea was that Pathfinders would provide ways for economies to agree on a set of objectives that would eventually include more and more economies and lead to larger and more tangible results. It has addressed, and it's very difficult to find an exact inventory of these, but it has addressed a dozen or more topics, exactly the kind of topics that we think of as parts of the new trading environment, difficult parts of the new trading environment: digital economy, mutual recognition agreements, privacy, and many of the aspects of cheaper, faster, better that we have discussed so far. It is, in fact, a remarkable framework for driving progress that, as best as I can tell, does not exist in any other international cooperative institutions. So let me now use this context to think about the 2010-2011 agenda. The dilemma that we have discussed so far is that it often takes a full year for a country to develop a theme for its vision of APEC, and by then it's too late to bring on the kind of concrete implementations. And that's why this vision of a 2-year APEC, in which Japan would be the place where some of the basic themes are developed, but then the implementation would take place in the US year, is so attractive. But I'm old enough to know that that it was once a 3-year APEC that we were thinking about, with Singapore, Japan, and the United States forming the context in which this new set of results would be rolled out. And we're about halfway through that 3-year period. So the problem, nevertheless, is with us. So what to do about it? And I think one outcome that I can see hopefully happening is that the United States can adopt next year the themes that are developed this year. I'm not sure exactly how those themes will ultimately be announced at the leaders' meeting. Perhaps new words are needed. I'm not sure about that. We can discuss that further. But whatever it is clearly now broad enough in its conception, in the way Mr. Nakamura set it out, to encompass many of the objectives that the United States would have and that other APEC economies would have. First of all, it discusses regional integration. Within that, the TPP is an obvious and important priority. And indeed, in some ways, the TPP is the ultimate pathfinder. It is a small group of economies which are trying to go through the very difficult steps of figuring out how the next stage of integration, given the more complex issues we now face, will be handled. But I would hope, and I think it would be very risky to put all of our eggs in the TPP basket. This is partly because not all APEC members are likely to be in the TPP horizon in the short run, but it's also because the timing of the TPP is very unpredictable, and we need to have a harvest or a series of harvests in that period of time while the TPP matures. So other issues, connectivity and other regional integration issues, need to be part of this basket of pathfinders or initiatives that hopefully represent the harvest next year. Jobs and investment. This fits nicely into the new growth rubric of the Japanese program that Mr. Nakamura presented. An awful lot of interest in that, of course, in the United States and across the region. The U.S. export doubling strategy, which many people know of, would fit very nicely with efforts to develop investment and facilitation projects in APEC. And finally, human security. And here, I think one issue that is receiving a great deal of attention now is the financing of aging, an issue which all of our economies are concerned with, and an issue on which APEC could begin some of this early difficult work that will need to be done. So let me conclude there, saying that what I hope will come out of this year is a basket of fruit. There is no better place, obviously, to collect the basket of fruit than the Asia Pacific. And let me say that one of the biggest fruit is pineapple. Pineapple is a sign of welcome and inclusiveness in many cultures, and no better place to get pineapple than Hawaii. So I look forward to our celebrating this in that form next year.
Thank you very much, Peter. Next, we'll have Gary Hufbauer, make his presentation. Gary?
Thanks very much. Well, as I think everyone here knows, climate negotiations have not accomplished a great deal so far, but the amount of paper produced by the UNFCCC and the IPCC and other folk, including this institute, would deforest Kalimantan. So I'm going to be very brief. That will be my main contribution. As Vice President Mondale indicated, the UN FCCC was in disarray in Copenhagen, and the the auspices for Mexico City and then South Africa are not terrifically bright at this point. What has happened is that a bottom-up approach to climate measures is replacing, in fact, has replaced a top-down approach. And it seems to me quite unlikely that APEC could succeed in kind of a top-down approach where the UN FCCC did not succeed, if only because within the APEC group there are the same divisions that was so conspicuous in Copenhagen. But having said that, since we have a captive audience here of Mr. Nakamura and Mr. Tong, and Wendy Cutler and Mr. Omori, let me propose just a few items, a very short list of items that APEC might achieve, not the big ambitious targets and glide paths and so forth, but just some items that might be achieved within APEC if they're still open to new agenda considerations. The first item is a peace clause in national legislation on border measures that would apply to imports for a reasonable period of time, let's say at least 3 years, to give the whole process more time to decide. And I would say extend the peace clause to the extent national governments can to which they can do to any WTO cases, so they wouldn't bring WTO cases against other countries during the peace period, and also to the extent they can to discourage private trade actions. Now, I know that's not entirely within the jurisdiction of the executive branch in many countries, but in any event, some commitment to try to discourage private trade actions that would limit imports where we have a climate issue. In other words, a generalized peace clause. I think that would be very helpful while the world is trying to sort out what measures are appropriate for climate, that we don't foul up the trade system. Secondly, and now here I look at Peter Drysdale because he's in front of me, the Australians made a signal contribution about 15 years ago to the measurement of subsidies in agriculture, and over time that really has fed in quite importantly to disciplining agricultural subsidies. So I call on Peter and his colleagues in Australia to do the same now for fossil fuel subsidies. That subject has been singled out by the G20 as needing action, and the numbers are terrific, but they're not well measured now, and there's no agreed measurement, and this is where Australia is so good at this kind of stuff. So we can get just a baseline of who's giving subsidies and how, coal, gasoline, the whole stuff, because when you look at it, of course, we're all trying to do things to provide incentives to renewable energy, but if you do the economics, if we could take away the subsidies for fossil fuel, that would probably do more to limit carbon emissions in the next, say, decade than whatever we're going to be able to provide by way of new subsidies or new incentives or whatever for renewable energy. So that's a big challenge. And now, since we have Japan in the chair this year, and Japan has both a lot of money and a lot of technical expertise, I would call on Japan to create a unit for monitoring, reporting, and verification. Now, this is a very contentious area, but this is absolutely critical foundation for any meaningful offset program and for any meaningful comparison between national efforts on it. And many countries do not have the capability to monitor, verify, report. It's a big effort. And Japan, I think, could really contribute within the APEC context to setting up the technical expertise and so forth, so that countries within the APEC area which wanted to draw on this could do it, and it could become a kind of an honest broker for this, what I would call a foundation stone for doing anything concrete on on future concrete measures, both on financial support and on bringing down the emissions trajectory. And my final, and here I can twit the U.S. government. We have Wendy Cutler as a captive person, right? Oh, we have another one here too. But he's so close to me, I'll leave it. Right. There is the subject of environmental goods and services, and that is on the Doha agenda. And we have urged, we being Jeff and myself and our colleagues here at the Institute, that another big effort, big push be put on the EGS, on the environmental goods and services. But it's also mentioned in the APEC context. So certainly, APEC can give a push to that. But very specifically, the United States and Europe can put ethanol and biofuels as an environmental good and services with a life cycle condition on CO2 emissions. I mean, this is just ridiculous, the U.S. position. And I know about Senator Grassley, you all know about this, but the position is ridiculous, that these are not counted as environmental goods and services. And with that blockage, you're not going to expect a lot of cooperation from other countries. We're not getting a lot of cooperation. So that's one thing the U.S. could do, and possibly it could say some nice things in the APEC context on that. But the other thing on environmental goods and services, which could be usefully done in the APEC context, and this is my final remark, is to halt the regrettable backward steps that have been taken within the last few months on binational procurement measures for the new renewable energy programs which are being instituted, particularly in the United States and China. Now, I would give China credit for starting it by having a very strong binational windmill program, and they're going to extend it to solar energy and whatever. But here in the United States, with China doing it, there's a lot of pressure in Congress for us to do it, and we have the awful example of the Buy America and the stimulus bill, which is now being replicated in anything to do with renewable energy. And APEC would be a good place to call a halt to this stuff. Thank you very much.
Kurt, if I could call on you to make your presentation, please.
All right, so I'm batting cleanup, and I'll try and go quickly. In order to be responsive to the topic of beyond trade, regional cooperation in other areas, I wanted to talk a bit about the growth strategy as it's emerging under the leadership of Japan with hopefully constructive help from the United States. Before I do that, though, I'd like to refer to two questions or mention two issues. One is the significance of APEC in the context of U.S.-Japan relations. APEC has really been a model of close U.S.-Japan teamwork. And I just really want to reach out and congratulate my Japanese colleagues, many of whom are in the room, for the leadership that they've shown. Japan has put its best and brightest people on the APEC case, and we've worked extremely smoothly together. There's a lot of chit-chat these days about the current status of U.S.-Japan relations, and this is one, I think, hopefully visible example of the kind of cooperation that continues to take place between the United States and Japan in fora throughout the planet. G8, G20, Major Economies Forum, OECD, I don't care where you go, among the most important partners of the United States is Japan, if not the most important partner in all those forums. So we're really taking that cooperative spirit to APEC. The working philosophy, I mean, your reference to Singapore is well taken, but now that we have the U.S. and Japan in the room, our working philosophy for APEC in 2010 and 2011 is a 1-2 punch. So a jab and a hook. I'm not sure which is left, which is right, but we really are working closely together and trying to achieve a lot. The second thing I wanted to just toss out just one or two ideas on is the question of the role of APEC in the region. It's been referred to today by a number of people. APEC really is and remains, from the United States perspective, the premier economic organization in the Asia Pacific. It is trans-Pacific in nature. It bridges both sides of the Pacific and brings us together. It's really an embodiment of the fact that oceans do not divide. When you talk about economics, oceans do not divide nations, they bring them together. And APEC is really a manifestation of that from the U.S. perspective. That said, there are other organizations out there, G20, the various ASEAN-based groups like the East Asia Summit, and some of these are newer and fresher, and so they get attention. We've been talking about how APEC is 20 years old, now 21. That means, I guess, we're old enough to drink, but it also means that it's not brand new and doesn't get the excitement that Ambassador Mondale described of that first time that the leaders met at Blake Island. Isn't necessarily there as a novel event. It's still extremely significant, but there are more forums out there, more opportunities to do things. Within that context, I think we need to refer to some of the core strengths of APEC as an institution. That includes leaders level participation, which, as described by Ambassador Mondale, it really provides an opportunity to push progress through the various governments. We have private sector participation to a greater extent than any other international organization that I'm aware of, with both institutionalized and ad hoc input from the private sector into the APEC process. We have a combination of policy debate and economic and technical cooperation, so-called ecotech that Dr. Omori referred to, that is also rather unique in these types of institutions, and is a great strength. And then we have the tradition of APEC working on trade issues, which gives us a very strong comparative advantage in looking at trade-related issues, particularly when you consider the relative strength of the G20 on financial issues. APEC, in that context, still has the ability, as Ambassador Nakamura said, to act as a locomotive for the Asia-Pacific region. A lot of the cabooses, or I guess this is I shouldn't do metaphors, things that have come off of the APEC locomotive, TPP. A lot of the bilateral FTAs the negotiations start in the APEC room, and then they go outside. The information technology agreement, or outside of trade, referring to the climate change topic that we were just talking about, things like Australia's enormous input in 2006 in putting out an APEC leader statement on climate, which was the first statement ever that significant economies put down numbers. Significant developing economies put down numbers. So to leverage these strengths, I think APEC needs to do two things. One is have clarity and vision, state what it's going to do and state it clearly so that people can understand it. And the other, and I'd like to sort of reference this as I talk about the growth strategy very quickly, is deal with the question of specific versus small. Often, when you try and get specific on an issue, you end up going small and having a workshop or doing something very concrete but relatively not ambitious. And APEC needs to continue to be specific on the issues that we cover, but also be ambitious. And it's a tricky thing to do, but I think with smart people involved, it can be done. In fact, just a reference again, Dr. Omori's presentation about structural reform efforts and the fact that he and his group are thinking seriously about name and shame approaches to structural reform, country-based initiatives that would require regular follow-up within the APEC context is extremely encouraging, and that's the kind of thing that we can do within APEC, even on topics which are very amorphous and difficult to get your hands around. So having said all that, I'll go very quickly just to highlight some of the approaches that we hope to take in support of the growth strategy, which Ambassador is currently discussing how we can broaden the agenda. We want to continue to work on the 5 areas that Dr. Omori outlined: competition policy, regulatory reform, regulatory transparency, but also start to tackle some other issues that are really important to the ability of economies to reform and rebalance, particularly labor market smoothness or flexibility, social safety nets, financial markets, and how those evolve over time. Obviously, in the context of what we currently have in the Asia Pacific region of rather grossly imbalanced current account balances and overall macroeconomic structures, there's a lot of work that can be done that will benefit both the over-saving economies and the over-investing economies. And we hope to do some serious work in APEC. On inclusive growth, and for those who aren't familiar with the concept, inclusive means making sure that everyone, or maybe not everyone, because it's impossible, but as many people as possible in each economy are experiencing the benefits of the economic growth that takes place as a result of globalization, of increasing regional economic integration. The APEC is going to tackle that by putting particular emphasis on small and medium enterprise development, worker retraining, and developing opportunities for women. These are difficult areas to work on, particularly small and medium enterprise development, which is a broad topic. There are numerous challenges to ensuring that small and medium enterprises develop quickly and have full participation in international commerce. But it's really important. I just want to throw out a couple statistics. Small and medium enterprises have accounted for almost 65% of new jobs created in the United States. They employ 80% of the workforce. SMEs constitute some 95% of all the enterprises in the Asia-Pacific region. It's really critical that we do this. It's a central piece of the President's National Export Initiative, and as Wendy said, we need to figure out a way to use APEC to educate small and medium enterprises in the United States that the opportunities are there in the Asia-Pacific, and they can take advantage of them. In worker retraining, there's going to be a human resource development ministerial meeting hosted by China this fall. We have high hopes that that will stimulate exchange on best practices and good ways of accelerating worker retraining. This is something that the United States can benefit from. It's also something that a lot of the economies that are transitioning from those first trading jobs, the light industry manufacturers, into more value-added jobs are desperately in need of in the APEC region, and it will foster growth region-wide. On women's economic opportunity, the United States and Japan, we announced this a couple weeks ago, are going to co-sponsor a Women's Entrepreneurship Summit in Japan in October. We'll invite people from throughout the region and really try and speak to the issue of how important it is for economic growth to have broader women's participation in each economy. The main point that we'll have officials will take home from that session, we believe, is that there's a direct correlation between women's economic participation and the pace of growth, and it's all about achieving prosperity, not only about fairness, although that is also, of course, very, very important. On green growth or sustainable growth, and this is what Dr. Hufbauer was just referring to, APEC's work thus far has primarily concentrated on energy efficiency and the promotion of green technology development. One of the best mechanisms that we've come up for that is a peer review mechanism where economies volunteer to be intensively counseled and evaluated by their peers for the actions that they've taken on energy efficiency. That's a good approach. We need to come up with more climate-relevant approaches. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I thought the ideas were extremely constructive. The U.S. is hoping to work with Japan in designing some work, particularly in the area that you mentioned of MERV, or measuring, reporting, and verifying climate undertakings. There's a real niche for APEC in this area, given that you have the Copenhagen approach of national-based targeting of progress in climate change. A lot of the economies in the region aren't sure how to implement commitments, or even soft commitments, or even just inclinations. to participate in this Copenhagen process and move forward. And APEC could do a lot to help that. Another area that we're going to hope to do a lot more in APEC is in the area of forests, deforestation, sustainable forestry, also extending that to the question of the peat, P-E-A-T, not P-E-T-E, in Borneo, and the fact that the destruction of peat bogs there is an enormous contributor to climate change. I need to wrap up. In innovative growth, I'll highlight the Digital Prosperity Checklist, which is a code of conduct agreed to among the APEC economies, which we intend to intensively implement in 2010 and 2011 to encourage the elimination or maintenance of openness and elimination of barriers in electronic commerce. Finally, on secure growth, I'll just mention food security because it is 5 minutes to lunch. Food security initiative is extremely important to the United States. It's important to Japan. Japan has stepped up by having a ministerial level agreement or a ministerial level meeting on food security this year, which will, we hope, put out a clear action plan for the Asia Pacific region, which combines promotion of agricultural productivity, increasing agricultural productivity in the region, but also working on promoting trade and investment in the region with a particular emphasis on, usually in trade we talk about import barriers. In the Asia Pacific, what we experienced in the most recent food price crisis was export barriers. It was hoarding, was what it was, and APEC has an opportunity this year to make a major statement to prevent that kind of activity in the future. So those are some thoughts. Just to last sentence I'd like to say is that when you look at Yokohama, please look at the outcomes in two ways. And I think the panels today were well designed to address this fact. There's an entire set of activity in APEC now which is creating growth. It's creating growth through regional economic integration. Bringing our economies closer together creates prosperity. At the same time, there's a set of activity now taking place in APEC, which this panel was intended to address, that shapes growth, that makes sure that as growth takes place, that it is balanced, it's inclusive, it's green, it's innovative, and it's secure. And I think that hopefully that conceptualization is something that people will understand and will be able to then, based upon that spelling out of APEC's goals at the end of 2010, take things forward in 2011 in an aggressive manner on implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Kurt. Since the panel is entitled Beyond Trade, APEC's Role in Regional Cooperation on Climate Change, Sustainable Development, Inclusive Growth, and Other Areas, given that APEC is generally dealing with economic considerations, as a forum, as the economies are sitting around talking about the various issues like sustainable growth, climate change, you have the juxtaposition of industrialized countries, developing countries. Is there enough of a database that they're all comfortable about making commitments or inclinations, as you've mentioned, Kurt, to try to sign on to some of these kinds of endeavors? And I'm wondering from whether it's Gary's perspective of seeing what's going on, or Peter and Dr. Omori and your perspective, is there enough of a database for the various economies to make those judgments?
If I could speak to that first, I think that's an excellent question, and it really depends upon the issue and the economies involved. And with credit to Charles Lake on this question, there's a progression in how issues are handled, which often starts with recognition of a problem, then trying to define the problem and measure where we are in the region. So usually you go sort of workshop, and then you've got best practices. The economies start to see what are the best ways to approach this issue and exchange opinions on that. And then you start to get into the more interesting stuff of defining principles or codes of conduct. These are the best practices, and you should do them. And then at the very end stage, you get to statements that we intend to, or we plan to, or we will. They never get to the within APEC context of we'll do it or else we can get sued. Mm-hmm. But you get to that point, and in a lot of these issues that we're still at the beginning of that progression, but in many of them, because of all the work that's taken place in APEC over the years, we're getting farther to the right end of that spectrum.
Gary, from your observation?
Well, there's a lot of data, but there are two areas where, even with a great deal of data, countries are afraid, as you say, to make commitments in climate change. Developing countries, led by China and India, but many others, believe that any internationally binding commitments on greenhouse gas emissions could, in the future, be a major obstacle to their growth aspirations. And you can have a lot of papers and so forth on this, but this is a very deep-seated concern, and makes them, well, hesitant, or even more than hesitant. They refuse at this point to make binding commitments. On the part of developed countries, particularly here in the United States, but also in Europe and probably also in Japan and Australia, there is an enormous fear of leakage and loss of competitiveness, both leakage in terms of carbon-intensive industries moving to the Chinas, Indias, South Africas, Brazils, and so you get the same amount or even more greenhouse gas emissions than you otherwise would have had, and meanwhile, your industries are hollowed out. Now, our colleague Trevor Hauser and Jake Weinstein and Rob Bradley and others we've done a book on this, and many have done books and have tried to analyze the likely impact of carbon restraint measures on both leakage and competitiveness, and the numbers don't nearly come out to the extent of political concern. But the political concern is what drives it, and so that's another serious problem.
Peter?
I don't have much to add to the environment issue. I think this is important that APEC takes this up, and it's interesting to hear Kurt's introduction to this. But my sense is that it will not be possible in all areas to reach full agreement, but nevertheless a lot of progress can be made, and those pieces where countries can achieve some common ground can make then ultimately a big contribution to the whole community moving forward. Particular area that I think is important this year is investment, and this is important to Japan, and it has been taken up by APEC before. It found it difficult to get the full consensus that one might have needed to make it an APEC-wide project, but the principles could be strengthened with a group of countries with the anticipation that additional countries will ultimately join. So this is an area, I think this is the kind of process of deepening which Kurt described, at which APEC is very good.
Dr. Omori?
Well, I'm not an expert in environmental issues, but the measurement and indicators are always something that we discuss on. So good indicators can facilitate policy discussions greatly, as is the case of ease of doing business initiative. But at the same time, no indicator can be perfect. So we have always have to sort of make our efforts to improve indicators and measurement. But having that said, even without reliable indicators, there are rooms for policy discussion. Thank you very much.
Very good. All right, well, let's thank our panelists for their time and the tremendous thought that they've given to this subject matter over their professional and career goals. So thank you very, very much.